Sumar, the political coalition of Yolanda Diaz and also of Inigo Errejón, wants to ideologically rearm itself. Inigo Errejón himself tells us about it.
We believe that in Spain, democratic and left-wing ideas need to regroup. We need to regroup to stop fighting the disputes from 40 years ago, but to fight them today.
And one of the main ideological battles they want to fight is to redefine, give a new meaning to the concept of freedom, so that in Spain we do not understand freedom as libertarians generally understand it. That is, the right to non-coercive interference by third parties, the respect me and I will respect you. Let me pursue my own life project in exchange for letting you pursue your own life project, in exchange for not trampling on each other.
And we have given, the document lays the groundwork for a strong ideological offensive to go out and challenge the concept of freedom.
First of all, however, it must be said that Rejón, and by extension Sumar, do not seem to properly understand the liberal libertarian concept of freedom, or at least if they comprehend it, they do not clarify it well. What they do is portray it in a caricatured manner, distort it, manipulate it, so they can dismiss it without engaging in a discussion about it.
We don't believe that freedom is the whim of the rich, the right to do whatever you can with your money.
But who says that freedom is the whim of the rich, the right of the rich to do whatever they want with their money? The rich or the non-rich will have the right to do whatever they want with their money or anything else, as long as they respect the freedom of other people, that is, as long as they do not coercively interfere with their life plans, as well as the property of those other people, as long as that property has been peacefully and justly acquired. Within the philosophy of liberal politics, a rich person does not have exclusive rights that the rest of the people lack. In fact, one of the fundamental principles of liberalism is legal equality, which implies that all individuals possess exactly the same basic rights and entitlements in a fair and just society. If a person who is not rich is forbidden, that is, they do not have the right to harm a third person, a rich person also does not have the right to harm that person. You are also not allowed to do it. If a non-wealthy person is prohibited from stealing someone else's property, a wealthy person is likewise prohibited from stealing that property. If a non-rich person is prohibited from committing contractual fraud to the detriment of a third party, a rich person will also be prohibited from doing so. The mistake that Errejón is making here, and that will also permeate his entire concept of freedom, which we will then develop, is that he confuses right with ability. A wealthy individual may possess the financial capability to purchase a private aircraft, economic capability that I do not have. Nevertheless, that does not mean that the affluent have a privilege that I lack. The rich have the right to purchase themselves a private plane similar to me. The law doesn't forbid me from buying myself a private plane. Now, the private plane seller will only sell it to me if I give him a certain amount of money in return. And if I do not possess that amount of money, I am unable to compel that individual to sell it to me, because in doing so, I would be infringing upon their rights of ownership over the property. Both the affluent individual and I have the privilege to make a purchase agreement with the seller of the private aircraft, but the affluent individual will have the financial means that I lack to close the deal with him. However, that does not imply that the wealthy possess more privileges than I do. The rights are precisely identical. Right to negotiate with another individual, in this instance the seller of the airplane, to finalize an agreement with them if both parties are in agreement, and to mutually transfer the properties. Simply because the airplane salesman refuses to provide me with the plane free of charge and instead is prepared to sell it to the wealthy individual for a reasonable sum of money, it does not imply that the wealthy individual possesses greater entitlements than I do to utilize the plane, because the wealthy man does not have the authority to compel the seller of the airplane to transfer it to him, similar to how I also lack that authority. Both of us have the right to attempt to come to an agreement with him in order for him to transfer it to us. But it will be the airplane seller, the rightful owner of the airplane, who will have the final say on whether or not to transfer it to us. And if I don't have anything to offer the airplane seller and the rich person does, the rich person will close the deal and I won't. But not because there's a difference in rights, but because the rich guy, in this case, has more economic capacity to close a deal with the airplane seller than I do. This confusion between right and ability is as ridiculous as stating that Arturo Pérez Reverte has the right to sell a greater number of books than I do. No, Arturo Perez Reverte has exactly the same right as me to sell books. Now, Arturo Perez Reverte sells more books than me because he has a knack for writing and connecting with the audience that is greater than mine. But Arturo Perez Reverte doesn't have any more rights than me when it comes to selling books. Perez Reverte writes a book and puts it up for sale. I am currently writing a book and planning to sell it. The evaluation, judgment, and decision-making process lies in the hands of others, determining whether they are interested in purchasing Perez Reverte's book, my book, both books, or none at all. But not even Perez Reverte has the right to force them to buy his book, nor do I have the right to force them to buy mine, and therefore if in the end Perez Reverte sells more than I do, it's not because he had the right to be read more, to be bought more, but simply because others, exercising their right to freedom and the right to dispose of their property freely, decide to buy more books by Perez Reverte than mine. Well, as I mentioned, this identical confusion between freedom and ability exists in the precise definition that Inigo Errejón presents of freedom, the fresh significance they aim to attribute to the term.
Without fear, freedom is the right to live boldly.
An individual can experience freedom, meaning they are not subject to aggression or threats of aggression from others, and yet still have fears and insecurities in their life. A businessman, for instance, may fear his company going bankrupt, but that doesn't imply he lacks freedom. When I publish a book for sale, I can feel scared that it won't sell, that it will be a commercial failure, that it is full of weak arguments, and that readers will discover it and make me look ridiculous, and so on. But that doesn't mean I'm not free. Of course, if a businessman has the ability to constantly anticipate better than the competition what the most urgent needs of consumers are, and has the ability to satisfy them, as I say, better than the competition, then that businessman will not be afraid of going bankrupt. But he won't have it because he has a much higher capacity to perform the entrepreneurial function than the rest of his competitors. Similarly, if I possess the capability to create flawless books without any errors, if I had the capacity to engage with millions of individuals through my books, well, I would also not have any fear that a book I have authored and published for sale would be unsuccessful, not be purchased, or contain numerous errors, and so on. However, simply lacking those abilities does not imply that we are devoid of freedom. They are different analytical plans that should not be mixed, because usually when they are mixed, when freedom is equated with ability, it is to validate my ability to something by infringing on the freedom of others. For example, if a businessman is not able to perform the entrepreneurial function better than the competition, how can we defend his right to not be afraid of going bankrupt? How can we make that businessman have the ability to not be afraid of going bankrupt? In other words, how can we defend, according to Errejón, his freedom? Because freedom is not being afraid. For instance, compelling consumers to purchase their products, or compelling taxpayers to subsidize that company, or compelling consumers to refrain from purchasing products from foreign competition. If we examine it, in all of these instances, we would be safeguarding the liberty of that business person, comprehending liberty as the lack of apprehension of becoming insolvent, encroaching upon the liberty of customers or taxpayers to utilize their liberty and property as they desire within the confines of their entitlements. Oh, for instance, how can we ensure the protection of my liberty to not feel afraid when putting a book up for sale on the market? Do you have a fear that it won't sell? Or are you scared that they'll criticize the errors they might find in the book and make fun of me? Once again, compelling citizens to purchase my book, or purchasing it through public institutions with funds forcibly obtained from taxpayers, that is, compelling taxpayers to buy a book they do not wish to buy, or prohibiting criticism of the errors in my book because it causes me anxiety, detecting the mistakes, and so on and so forth 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 and so forth. All of that would be mechanisms to safeguard my freedom, understood as not being afraid. All of that would be, mechanisms to uphold and protect my freedom within the confines of society. However, all of that is simply methods to infringe upon the freedom of others when properly comprehended. Therefore, my capability to not be afraid which in turn relies on possessing or not possessing other abilities, my capability to not experience fear, is not my freedom. And when we commence equating both, as I state typically, it is to rationalize trampling on the genuine freedom of other individuals. In other words, when we start justifying the complete disregard for someone else's life project. Because I desire to live my life in a specific manner without experiencing fear, I must compel others to act in a particular manner or utilize their belongings in a specific way in order to maintain the lifestyle I desire. So I am manipulating other individuals using coercion in order to satisfy my own needs while disregarding the needs of others. And what about this notion of freedom, which is the one defended by Erechon? Freedom as the ability to coercively instrumentalize others to pursue my own goals and manipulate their actions. How this idea of freedom that Erechon defends needs to coercively sacrifice the life project of some people to promote the life project of others. Erechon needs to sell us that it is a democratizing concept of freedom, a concept of freedom based on communal living.
Democratizing freedom means freedom shouldn't be a luxury for the rich, but a fear-free life for all, ensured by rights and living in society. And so our concept of positive freedom, Republican freedom, is the freedom that those who agree in common have. Not freedom despite, freedom with others.
At first glance, it might seem like what Erechon is saying here is that if one person lives next to another, then the first person already has the right to coerce the second person to meet their needs. If I'm afraid of it raining and my neighbor has 2 umbrellas, then I have the right to steal one of his umbrellas. Because if I don't steal the umbrella, then I'm not free because I'm scared, and freedom is living without fear. Freedom in this instance would be the capability to avoid getting wet in the rain, and thus the capability to be able to appropriate my neighbor's umbrella, even employing violence to seize it. And if we reside together, and he possesses 2 umbrellas, and I do not possess any, then it is not equitable that he obtains the privilege of living without fear of the rain, simply because he has 2 umbrellas, when I do not have that right. Because since I don't have an umbrella, I don't have the ability to use it. And freedom, I insist, is capability. Ability to not be afraid because I possess the ability, for instance, to have an umbrella in front of the rain. But in reality, Erechon isn't exactly defending this. Erechon is not advocating for each person to unilaterally use violence against others to satisfy their own life projects at the expense of sacrificing the life projects of others. Erechon's defense is that this process, in which individuals use violence to forcefully impose their life goals on others, should be regulated, controlled, and channeled through an institution known as the state. The aim is to protect the interests of all parties involved and prevent the exploitation of one group at the expense of another, ensuring a fair and equitable society for everyone. Merely because individuals reside together in a society, it does not imply that they possess the entitlement to employ force against others for the purpose of enhancing their self-assurance in various life circumstances. Now, it would be a real mess, extremely chaotic, highly anarchic, if every single person could take justice into their own hands, if every individual could exercise unilateral violence against others. That right to not be afraid, that strengthening of the ability of some people to not be afraid at a cost. The liberty of other individuals is guided, structured, and organized by the governing body known as the state. The individuals, through democratic means, determine the specific abilities of certain individuals that should be advanced, strengthened, and supported, even if it means limiting the freedom of other individuals. For instance, if someone has saved and gathered a property, the government can choose to take it away and give it to another person who the government believes requires it more. Thus, the life project of an individual who has saved, created, and amassed a possession is relinquished to advance the life project of another individual who acquires the pilfered property. And that's exactly what Erechon defends. That the person who is robbed through the state has the obligation to let themselves be robbed because they live in society. And residing in society implies that others have the ability to exercise coercion against you. And that right of others to exert coercion against you is organized, formalized, and institutionalized by the state in a systematic and legally sanctioned manner. Therefore, in the end, this concept of freedom ultimately transforms into the privilege of the state to indulge in the true freedom of all the individuals whose freedom the state desires to feast upon and take advantage of for its own benefit. In other words, Erejon's concept of freedom leads to the concept of state sovereignty, which may have its origins in democratic legitimacy, but ultimately it is state sovereignty. The state possesses a superior entitlement over the remainder of society to act as it desires and to reverse as it desires. At the end of the day, the one in charge in a society is the government. And in that world, where the state is above and individuals are below, where individuals, people, are subordinate to the state's imperium, to the whims and arbitrariness of the state, to do and undo as they please with the freedoms of those individuals. In that world, of course, politicians like Erejon are the ones who temporarily enjoy that right of sovereignty over others. In that world, Erejon, as an individual, doesn't have the right to pressure others, but Erejon, as a politician, as an agent of state sovereignty, of course he does have the right, the privilege, to pressure others. In other words, it means not infringing on the freedom of others. Deep down, however, this concept of Erejon's freedom is a concept that defeats itself. It's an internally incoherent concept, and it's just that those people who don't have the ability, either directly or indirectly, to influence the actions of the government, of course they can live in fear of the government. People who are afraid that they will be coerced by the government, for example, because they are in the minority within society, and the majority of society, or at least those who control the levers of power, want to attack the freedoms of those minorities, those people, of course, are going to live in fear. What does Rejon offer? Tough luck, they'll need to handle it. That because of living in society, they are obliged to live under the boot of state coercion. They are obliged to sacrifice their freedom in order to promote the ability of others. They are compelled to reside in fear so that others do not have to reside in fear. That is the reason why Rejon appeals to an organic, democratic, communal concept of freedom. What matters is not the freedom of each individual in particular, nor is it the life project of each person. The crucial point is that the state has the ability to guarantee, through the use of coercion, that in general terms, in democratic terms, society as a whole, not each individual in particular, but society as a whole, lives without fear or minimizes its fear through the promotion of its capabilities, through the coercive action of the state. Essentially, it is basically appealing to freedom in order to destroy freedom itself and undermine the very principles it claims to uphold, thereby perpetuating a paradoxical state of affairs.